Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. In this video, we'll be going over the history of Mississippi. We'll be going over some of the history though, mainly up to the Civil War. If you like today's video, please like and subscribe, and press notifications as I'll be posting more videos just like this one. And without further ado, let's get into it. At the end of the last ice age, Native Americans and Paleo-Indians appeared in what is today the southern United States. A variety of indigenous cultures arose in the region, including one that built great earth mounds over 2,000 years ago. While the natives occupied this region, the Mississippian cultures developed their own language, pottery, and culture, and possibly adding their new form of social structures. As we fast forward a bit to the very early years of European encounters, Mississippian cultures disappeared by this time, and the descendants of these cultures were the Chickasaw and Choctaw peoples, who were later by the colonists called among the 5 civilized tribes of the Southeast. Other tribes also inhabited these areas of modern-day Mississippi. Spanish, French, and English settlers traded with these tribes in the early colonial years. During the early 19th century, the cotton gin was made, which was a revolutionary product. It allowed for the cultivation of cotton to be profitable, and its development could feed the international demand for cotton in the 19th century. The cotton gin was a machine that quickly and easily separated cotton fibers from their seeds. It also allowed for greater productivity than manually separating cotton. It was created by Eli Whitney in 1793. Modern-day automatic cotton gins use multiple powered cleaning cylinders and saws. This is far superior than their handheld powered ones before it. Migrants from the United States then started to enter Mississippi from the north and the east, mainly coming from the upper south and coastal areas. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 removed most of the indigenous peoples during the 1830s west of the Mississippi River. It was signed into law by President Andrew Jackson on May 28, 1830. The first major European expedition into the territory that became Mississippi was a Spanish one. A man named Hernando de Soto came through in the early 1540s, while the French claimed the territory as part of their New France colony. They started to build settlements along the Gulf Coast. In 1716, Natchez was founded as Fort Rosalie on the Mississippi River. The town became dominant and was a trading post in the area. The Spanish and French colonial ruling areas influenced many social relations of the settlers who had enslaved Africans. In Louisiana, for example, there was a third class of people, the free people of color. What we would refer to as mixed-race people today, the free people of color had white European colonists and enslaved African in them. But they could have also been mixed with Native American, or they could have been free blacks with little mixture at all. The planters often formally had supportive relationships with their mistresses of color. This would sometimes result in them being freed and their multiracial children. The fathers even passed on property to their mistresses and children, or arranged education for their children so they could learn trade. Some wealthy male colonists would sometimes send their mixed-race sons to France for education, and some would enter the military there. New Orleans was the place for free people of color, as they often migrated there, as New Orleans had more opportunities for them. Mississippi was also ruled by the Spanish after France's defeat in the 7 Years' War, which took place from 1756 to 1763. The 7 Years' War is sometimes regarded as the First World War, as it took place all over the world, including the colonies of the European powers, while the southern part of Mississippi was part of West Florida under the British. In 1783, the Mississippi area was transferred from Great Britain to the United States, after the Americans won their independence in the American Revolutionary War. And after the Peace of Paris, the southern part of Mississippi came under Spanish rule as a part of Spanish West Florida. Throughout this time of the colonial period, Native Americans changed their alliances to achieve what's best for themselves, as they were looking for self-benefit in any possible way. Before 1798, the state of Georgia claimed the entire region extending from west of the Chattahoochee to the Mississippi River, and they tried to sell their lands there. After the Yazoo land scandal of 1795, the state of Georgia seceded the area to the United States national government for its management in 1802. In 1804, the Louisiana Purchase happened. In 1800, Napoleon Bonaparte, the first consul of the French Republic, regained ownership of Louisiana from Spain. in exchange for territories in Tuscany. The reason for this was to try to regain a French colonial empire, but France's failures to suppress the Saint-Domingue rebellion, as well as warfare with the United Kingdom, prompted Napoleon to sell Louisiana to the United States. When the United States got their hands on Louisiana, they assigned the northern part to the Mississippi Territory, and the southern part became the Louisiana Territory. The Mississippi Territory was sparsely populated, and from the start, it already suffered from hard times with development, an issue that Mississippi still has to this day. This treaty, which ended Spanish control of Mississippi, happened in 1795, but Spain continued to hurt the development of Mississippi by harassing trade. Things didn't start popping off until the creation of the cotton gin, where the riverfront areas of the Mississippi developed as cotton plantations. These plantations ran off slave labor. The Mississippi and Yazoo River is where these plantations were most developed at. These rivers offered beautiful transportation to markets. America and Spain continued to have disputes even after the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. But in 1810, European American settlers that were in West Florida rebelled and declared their freedom from Spain. James Madison, the president, argued that the territories between the Mississippi and the Perdita Rivers, which included most of West Florida, had become under the United States under the Louisiana Purchase. The District of Mobile was annexed in 1812, and the Americans from the United States occupied Clinton, Mississippi in 1813. Fertile, high-quality, inexpensive cotton land attracted many settlers to the area. The area's migration was mainly coming from Georgia and the Carolinas and also from Virginia. The Mississippi Territory's population grew drastically. From the time of 1798 to 1820, it went from 9,000 to 222,000 people, most of whom were enslaved African Americans brought by settlers or from slave ship traders. The first migrants were traders and trappers, then herdsmen, and then finally farmers. Conditions in the Southwest initially resulted in democratic societies for whites. But cotton cultivation resulted in an elite group of white planters who controlled the politics for the state for decades. Mississippi and cotton go hand in hand, and cotton is embedded into Mississippi's history. Mississippi is located in the Deep South, and cotton was a very profitable business to get into. But it came at the expense of Native Americans. Earlier, I briefly mentioned the Indian Removal Acts of 1830. But the act forced the 5 civilized tribes to secede their lands and move west of the Mississippi. Enslaved Africans were forced and moved there with their owners' families, where many of them came from the Upper South. As the state gained land from the Indians, they sold these lands to white migrants, which is why white immigration continued to come into the state. On December 10, 1817, Mississippi became a state. It was the 20th state of the Union. Natchez became the capital of Mississippi at first, but as the population grew, the capital was moved to a more central location, and that's when they picked Jackson, named after the general. It was named after President Andrew Johnson. In Mississippi, Christianity was the major religion, mainly of Protestant roots. These 3 denominations leading. By the time of the Civil War, vast amounts of Mississippi were still underdeveloped. In 1832, the state constitution forbade any further importation of slaves by the domestic slave trade, but this was later repealed. Competition grew high as planters increased their holdings of land and slaves. The price of land rose, and small farmers were driven into less fertile regions. By 1860, of the 347,000 whites, only 31,000 possessed slaves. And of this, 2/3 held less than 10. Fewer than 5,000 slaveholders had more than 20 slaves. Poor whites occupied marginal farmlands, removed from rich cotton lands, and grew food for their families. And they did not grow cotton. Even if they didn't own slaves, most white Mississippians supported slavery. Whites were considered above blacks in social status. In 1836, a slave insurrection scare resulted in the hanging of a number of slaves. This was common practice in the South after such incidents. In the 1850s, cotton was king. The white gold, as they would call it, was such a profitable thing that it was almost like having money itself. The institution of slavery was really a thing because of one thing: money. Since money was a very important thing to have, it was used at the expense of others. The high price of cotton on the international market meant that there was money to be made from these plantations. In Mississippi, there was a huge wealth imbalance. and large slave populations were necessary for economic growth. This all played a role in Mississippi state politics, and political support grew for secession. In the Deep South, Mississippi was among 6 states with the highest proportion of slave populations. Mississippi was the second state to secede from the Union on January 9th of 1861. In 1860, the population was 791,000 people. African Americans made up over half of the population at 55%, but were overwhelmingly enslaved. International demand was high. Mississippi and other Deep South states exported cotton to Britain, France, and New England, and New York. The Deep South even had strong economic ties with the Northeast. In 1820, half of all exports from New York were related to cotton. Southern businessmen traveled to the city so frequently that they even had their own favorite hotels and restaurants. Mississippi's per capita wealth was well above the U.S. average, and even though modernizers encouraged vegetables and livestock, white gold cotton prevailed. Cotton planters were very rich, and they invested their money in buying more lands and buying more slaves. Also, children were educated privately. But not everything in Mississippi was going so good. The state government invested little into infrastructure. Mississippi railroads lagged behind that of other states. The biggest thing that troubled planters was their biggest nightmare, abolition. But if need be, they would secede from the Union, create their own country, and expand to the south, into Mexico and Cuba. But they really never expected war until the late 1860s. Division of labor on large plantations included the elite house slaves, a middle group of overseers, divers, and skilled craftsmen, then the lower class of the unskilled field workers whose main job was picking cotton. White owners hired white overseers to direct them to work. Slaves used forms of resistance by breaking tools and work slowdowns. Even though there was no slave revolts, whites would create rumors about revolts. On the plantation, they would make up their own culture and often develop leaders through religion. They would develop their own religious practices and develop their own style of Christianity. They would pick stories that spoke to them the most, such as Exodus. In 1860, only 1,000 of the 437,000 blacks in the state were recorded as free. Most of these freed people lived in wretched conditions near Natchez. During the Civil War, more than 80,000 Mississippians fought. The fear that white supremacy may be lost is one of the reasons why men joined the Confederate Army. Men who owned more property, including slaves, were more likely to volunteer. Men in Mississippi River counties, regardless of their wealth, joined at lower rates, and people living in the river counties were especially vulnerable, and it made them sometimes leave the Confederacy altogether rather than facing invasion by the Union Army. The Mississippi River was very important to control during the Civil War. To achieve their goals of capturing the Mississippi, the Union launched many battles in 1862 and 1863. The Vicksburg Campaign became one of the most important as it fought for control of the last Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. After the city fell on the 4th of July of 1863, it effectively gave the Union control of the Mississippi and cut off the western states and crushed the Confederacy's dreams in the West. As Union troops advanced, slaves joined their alliance, and after the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, more slaves left the plantations, and thousands of former slaves in Mississippi enlisted in the Union Army in 1863. The Battle of Grand Gulf was a Union loss, while the Battle of Port Gibbons was a Union victory. And General Sherman's march from Vicksburg to Meridian, Mississippi, which was Sherman's first application of total war tactics. Other important battles of the Civil War that happened in Mississippi would be the Battle of Raymond and Bryce's Crossroad. During the Civil War, disease was more likely to kill people than direct combat and battle wounds. Mississippi after the Civil War had gone through some hard times. Racial issues, economic problems, the list goes on, but I want to save that for another part. Maybe in the future, I'll make a part 2. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Be sure to like and subscribe and turn on notifications, as I'll be posting more videos just like this one. Thank you, and God bless.